Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3 Replicant Night by J.W. Jeter. Chapter 4. A knock at the door. Oh boy! The alarm clock danced on top of the bedside table. Daddy's home! Christ! Sarah laid the back of her hand across her eyes, trying to block out what was left of the day's illumination and any other sensory data coming into her nervous system. As much as she had been expecting, even in a perverse fashion, looking forward to this moment, it had still crept up on her without warning. Until now. I bet that's him. I bet that's him, all right. She wished again that she had spent the money for the third bullet. Just shut the hell up. Her brain felt both sand-filled and fuzzy from the cumulative toxins of troubled sleep. Sarah pulled herself into a sitting position on the edge of the gray mattress, then watched as the apparent separate entity of her hand fumbled inside the table's single drawer. Mrs. Niemand, excuse me. From the opposite wall of the bedroom, the calendar had caught sight of the bright metal cylinders tumbling in Sarah's palm. But what exactly are you doing? Brass glinted at her fingertips, though the bullets' tapered points were dull, leaden in color. None of your business. She slipped the bullets into the gun from the table, then closed up the chamber. Don't worry about it. Humanity is my business, Mrs. Niemand, though that was said in other contexts. It applies in this situation as well. I don't need the literary allusions. Sarah shifted the gun to her left hand and used her right to smooth her dark, disordered hair back from her brow. Some previous tenants of the hovel, who had either killed themselves or managed to get shipped off the planet while the star-bound emigration vessels were still running, had shelled out for the appliances to be hooked up to the library trunk feed. The penurious Niemanns had canceled the service, but the calendar had the rudiments of a university education soaked up in its offline banks and didn't mind showing it off, all of which had added to the general hell of Sarah's existence. Maybe 4, she thought. I should have bought 4 bullets. The knock at the door sounded again, blows hard enough to shake the hovel's thin plastic walls. A rain of soft, sneeze-provoking dust drifted down upon the bed. Come on! The alarm clock shrilled even more excitedly. Let's go see! Sarah placed the muzzle of the gun against the clock's face, at the exact center from which the 2 black hands radiated. Let's be real quiet. She pushed the clock back across the table, so Daddy and Mommy can have a little quality time together. All right? Okay, squeaked the clock. It cowered back against the wall. Mrs. Niemand! The calendar fluttered its pages at her as she walked past. I implore you, don't do anything you'll regret later. There's not going to be a later. The gun's weight dangled at the end of her arm. So regret's not a problem. Sarah! Using her real name, the calendar cried after her. Please, don't! In the front part of the hovel, a space barely wider than what her outstretched arms could have reached across, The percussion on the door was even louder, enough to start peeling some of the web of silvery duct tape and glue tacky patches away from the torn seams and other leak points. The hovel shivered and hissed, as though apprehending its own demise. Sarah wondered what Deckard was going on about, pounding on the door with that much force. He's that happy about being home? Maybe he had finally flipped out, gone all the way around the bend of that dark corridor that had always been there inside his head. Some bad retro TV fantasy of domestic bliss had wormed its way into his thoughts and taken over. Some vision of Mr. Neiman coming back here after a long, hard day at work, to be greeted by Mrs. N in a lace-edged kitchen apron and heels, bearing a cold stainless steel pitcher of gin and vermouth, the life their great-great-grandparents had lived, at least inside their sitcom fantasies. "Take it easy!" More strips of sealant tape dangled loose, trailing like thick party streamers from the hovel's low ceiling. "You're going to knock the place over!" A muffled voice came from the other side of the door, but Sarah couldn't make out what he'd said. She batted another sticky section of tape away from her face and reached for the door's knob. In the silver of time it took to turn the knob and pull the wobbling front door open, Sarah had entertained the notion of going with Deckard's anticipatory fantasy, or at least stringing him along with it for a few minutes. She could act as though there were, in fact, some measure of affection between them. She could even try once more to be Rachel, his long-dead and long-remembered love. The pretending wouldn't be unpleasant. There was still a room inside her head in which her own desire for all of that was still kept. Like an ancient white wedding dress, never used and carefully folded between sheets of tissue paper. "That's what the bastard deserves," thought Sarah, as her fingertips touched the doorknob, to be jerked around the way she had been, by a forged iron chain bolted to the heart. To be led to believe one thing, even for a second, then be slammed up against the even more unyielding steel wall of reality. In her other hand, the one dangling by her side as she reached to pull open the door, she had the perfect representation of what reality had come to mean for her. Loaded and cocked, she had already decided she didn't want to even try to screw around with Deckard's head anymore. There would be no Rachel-like homecoming kiss for him. If there were any irrational hopes left inside the son of a bitch that would rise upon his seeing the human original of the replicant face for which he'd fallen, they'd be dashed by the very next thing he'd see. A circle of cold metal with a dark black space at its center. Sarah's hand was already lifting the gun into position as she stepped back from the door swinging open toward her. Two faces looked in at her. Two men, neither of them Rick Deckard. The eyes behind their matching square-rimmed glasses widened as they focused on the gun she was holding a few inches from their foreheads. Is this the Neiman residence?" The man to the left swallowed nervously. The two of them didn't appear to be twins, but looked as if they were trying to be. "If it's not, we're sorry." "Maybe this is a bad time?" Beads of sweat had welled up on the other's brow. Tiny images of the gun floated in the wet mirrors. "Maybe we could come back some other time." Sarah let the gun lower of its own weight. She leaned against the side of the doorway. The hovel swayed and audibly creaked. "My apologies, gentlemen." Beyond the pair, the dimly lit corridors of the UN emigrant colony were visible. The rounded angles filled with rubble trembling in the air-lost breezes. "I just woke up." One of the men tried an uneasy smile. "You were expecting someone else?" "My husband, actually." The two men exchanged glances, their heads pivoting a fraction of an inch toward each other, as though linked by some simple, invisible mechanism. The same unseen gear turned their owlish gazes back to Sarah. "Mrs. Niemand," the one on the left spoke with somber intonation. "We can tell that you lead a tragic life." In the corridor leading toward the emigrant colony center, beneath the banks of flickering gray dead fluorescent tubes, devolved human figures moved, scuttling furtively with their last meager, pawnable treasures clutched to their chests, heading for the ragtag booths and alleys of the black market district. Even farther down the scale, appearing hardly human at all, were the creeping forms of those who had completely fallen out of the colony's hard screw economy. Those who'd come to the frayed end of their money and possessions had been cut off from the cable monopoly's feed. Faces devoid of reason as any vegetable lifted and swiveled toward the scene at the Niemand hovel's front door. Idiot eyes and other receptors searching for any sensory input. Red stigmata flecked the angles of the stimulus-lorn heads, with the same markings repeated on the corridor's dented walls. Every muscle near the softly keening mouths twitched with the constant hunger of misfired synapses. "A tragic life," mused Sarah, as she gazed past the two surprised callers. The length of her vision reached beyond the other, locked or boarded up hovel doors to low-ceilinged rooms containing yet more collapsing nervous systems. She wasn't sure what the man meant. She had worked a long time to engineer the destiny that had brought her to this place, a particular hell, or anyone at all. "I belong here," thought Sarah. Seized by a dreadful suspicion, she refocused on the two men at her door. "You're not Jehovah's Witnesses, are you?" That would be all she needed right now, to get handed an animated watchtower, complete with stereophonic sound effects triggered by the warmth of her thumb and forefinger. Or new reformed apocalypticists, another of the groups that had been seen recently evangelizing through the emigrant colonies. She looked to see if one of them was carrying a miniature holographic projector suitable for evoking biblical dioramas in the corridor's thin, acrid-smelling air. The two men gazed blankly at her, their black-rimmed square lenses. "No," the left one shook his head. "We're not here to ask you for money or anything." Her laugh barked out. "Good call. This is a personal matter, for you alone, Mrs. Niemand." He raised a pale, fussily manicured hand, pointing to the interior of the hovel behind her. "May we come in to talk with you? I'm sure you'll find it of interest." Gun dangled at her side. Sarah peered more closely at the two men. They seemed oddly familiar to her, positions on a memory track that her brain hadn't moved along for some time. Her eyes had just adjusted to the corridor's partial light spectrum. She could better perceive the pair now. White shirts and narrow lapelled suits, black as an old-fashioned undertaker's. Anal retentive bow ties cinched tight onto their reedy, knobbly throats, not much bigger around than the narrow wrists exposed at their cuffs. The men's owlish regard, framed by the sharp-cornered spectacles, tweaked a chord in her gut. The snufflers in the corridor's rubble had started edging closer, attracted by the sounds of human voices. Sarah knew that if she slammed the door shut and left the two men outside, and they went on pounding and calling to her through the thin panel, the hovel would be overrun by desperate hordes, the pressure of their clambering bodies enough to collapse the rickety walls. "All right," Sarah stepped back from the door. "Get in here, but you'd better make your spiel quick. As I said, I'm expecting my husband any time now." She gave another bitter laugh. God knows he's a jealous son of a bitch. Once inside, with the corridor's sickly light and recycled air shut away, she busied herself with her black market cigarettes, extracting one of the dwindling number from the cellophane-swathed pack and getting it lit, tossing the charred match onto the floor with the others. She tilted her head back and dragged the smoke into the innermost recesses of her lungs, already feeling it percolate out into her clamoring veins. Exhaled, a blue cloud swirled, then streamed in a tapering thread toward the nearest leak in the wall. "So what is it you wanted to talk about?" Sarah didn't turn around, but could hear the two men shuffling in the room's narrow confines behind her. In a too brief moment of sated peace, she regarded the orange-red coal at the end of the cigarette. "Whatever your pitch is, I hope it's good." The one who had been doing all the speaking shifted his voice to a flat, level tone. "For starters, we know you're not anyone named Neiman. That's an alias for both you and the former LAPD Blade Runner. Real name Rick Deckard, with whom you've been posing as man and wife. Your name is Sarah Tyrell." She stood where she was, showing no movement, no reaction. The gray shroud of her smoke-laden breath was the only sign of life. She had cupped an elbow in her free hand, hitting an aristocratic pose both studied and natural to her. The angle of her head, the trace of one dark lock across the corner of her brow. She could close her eyes and imagine herself another world and another life away from this one. Back in the executive suite and private living quarters of the Tyrell Corporation headquarters on Earth, in Los Angeles. Back in the tight, secretive epicenter of all the wealth and power she had inherited upon the death, the murder of her uncle Eldon Tyrell. From the great vaulted windows, there had been a view across the city's roiling inferno, the alleys and streets packed close at the base of the Tyrell ziggurat and slanting towers. All gone now. Sarah watched the smoke twist and thin and disappear. L.A. remained forever imploding inside the furious mass of its mottled citizens. Glitter-eyed thieves and murderers and worse, locked in their scythe-led dance with the black leather cops and blade runners and worse. All held in the masked, emotionless gaze of those urban tribespeople who'd cut themselves so far out of the loop that they might as well have been observers from another world, another time, centuries forward or back. An Asian grace, jingling fleets of Chinese bicycles, cutting through the neon-lit sheets of rain, ignoring the diluting blood and broken glass at the wary assassin's feet. Sarah knew that was the discreet charm of L.A. You could go about your business even if it meant killing people, or the things that looked just like people, and everyone else on the street would mind their own affairs. Even when the Tyrell Corporation headquarters had self-destructed in the apocalypse that she herself had engineered and brought to pass, there had probably been streets full of faces that had glanced up for only a moment at the fire turning the night sky's rain to steam. Then they had returned to scurrying and pushing and shoving toward their own dark, unknowable desires. "Miss Tyrell?" The man's voice came from behind her, cutting through the deep reverie, the vision of that other world and time into which she had fallen. "There really is no use denying it. We know who you are." A certain pleasure came from hearing her own true name spoken again, by anyone other than Deckard, in whose mouth it was something close to a curse, a prison sentence she could never outlive. Sarah looked over her shoulder at the two men, giving them the coldest edge of her half-smile. "So what agency are you from?" She raised an eyebrow. "The local authorities?" There were police in the emigrant colonies, but they worked almost entirely for the cable monopoly, terrorizing deadbeat subscribers and rooting out illegal taps on the wire. "Or perhaps you're from Earth? UN?" That was a possibility. The colonies were laced with informants, ratting on each other to the intelligence clearinghouse back in Geneva. "Perhaps LAPD? It wouldn't surprise me." The point of her smile sharpened. "Though I should remind you, there's no extradition allowed between Earth and Mars, per the UN's Immigration Authority. So if you were planning on taking me back with you to face whatever charges you might have against me, you're somewhat out of luck." The more talkative man gave what was meant to be a smile, both reciprocal and pleasant. But that came off eerily forced, a mannerism whose performance he had studied. "We didn't come to extradite you, Miss Tyrell." For a moment she doubted if they were any kind of police at all. They must be some kind of amateurs, thought Sarah. After lighting the cigarette, she had picked up the gun again from where she had set it down. It even had the right number of bullets to take care of both of the men. Unless they had some kind of major backup standing around near the hovel, these two might just as well have marched into their own coffins. "All right," she said. The gun made a convenient pointer to direct toward each of the men in turn. "If you're not police, then what the hell are you?" "Don't you know?" The same man peered at her, the expression on his face one of both puzzlement and disappointment, bordering on sheer heartbreak. "Can't you tell just by looking at us?" She frowned. "I never saw either one of you before. You might have, but you probably wouldn't remember or even have noticed. You wouldn't have had to." The disquieting feeling she had gotten before when she had studied the men's appearance out on the hovel's doorstep arose in her again. She felt the pressure of the two pairs of eyes, slightly magnified and distorted behind the square glasses. That's it. Sarah nodded slowly to herself. The glasses. She knew as well that it hadn't been a lapse of memory, a failure to remember, but her own silent, unspoken will shutting out that image of another face, older than either of these two men, wrinkled like parchment or thin ancient leather, with a gaze that had been grossly enlarged by lenses of exactly the same shape, clear squares bordered in heavy black, so that the eyes had appeared like high-resolution, full-color video screens that watched and judged and cruelly absorbed all who fell within their scan. That was the memory that the two men's appearance had triggered, but some defensive portion of her brain had shut out, lest it wound her again. The memory of her uncle's gaze, the glass-shrouded eyes of Eldon Tyrell. As much as was possible for the two men standing in front of Sarah in the hovel, they had managed to turn themselves into grotesque clones of the replicant murdered head of the Tyrell Corporation, or tributes to that fallen leader. The totem aspects, the square-framed glasses, precise as geometrizing instruments, the equally meticulous and fuzzy clothes, incorporated like the fetishes of the dead into their own gestalt. Ineffectually, futilely, the two figures lacked the old man's withered potency, the timeless and time-fed negative aura of great wealth and greater desire, moving through dark shaded spaces, silent rooms, bank vaults, and sweat-glistening silk bed sheets. The two men looked like overgrown, lank-limbed children dressed up in their father's discarded clothing. Sarah felt a shiver of instinctive fear as she gazed upon them, catching sight of the mad worm at the pupil's centers behind the square glasses. Held for a moment longer by the fear of the two living men and the dead one, she could not speak. "We're not from the police," said the one who'd spoken before. "We're from the Tyrell Corporation." Her flash of anger banished any other emotion. "There is no Tyrell Corporation," her voice lashed out, the cutting tip of her own sharpened tongue. "Not anymore." They exchanged another glance, then turned their magnified and now sorrowful gazes upon her again. The other one spoke. "We were afraid that was what you believed, that you didn't know." Strips of sealant tape drifted like slow seaweed in the hovel's hissing drafts. Sarah batted away the nearest tendril with the muzzle of the gun. "Know what?" Behind the square-framed glasses, the men's eyes lit up with simultaneous enthusiasm. "That the Tyrell Corporation wasn't destroyed. It survives. It still exists, as it always has, and always will." The fervor in the man's voice amused Sarah. "And this is what you came here to tell me?" She could feel her own smile turning gentle, tolerant. "That there's a few faithful employees, such as yourself, true believers, and you're somehow keeping the flame alive. Really?" She shook her head. "That's very touching. How many show up at the staff meeting? A couple dozen." The more talkative one glowered sulkily at her. "It's not just a few of us, Miss Tyrell. We're not fools." "That's right," said his partner. "This is bigger than that. Much bigger. We represent the other Tyrell Corporation, the shadow company that already existed before the one that you knew was destroyed." She made no reply. because she knew that the men, the mysterious callers who had appeared on her doorstep, were speaking the truth. There had been intimations, things whispered and things left unspoken, referred to by only a nod and a partial, omniscient smile on the face of her uncle, all referring to that other Tyrell Corporation, the shadow of the one whose light-studded Aztec pyramid had loomed over the dense sprawl of Los Angeles. Shadow being the operative word, an entity made of darkness that moved in darkness and did dark things, darker than what Eldon Tyrell and the corporation that acted out in the open did, which would take some effort, Sarah knew. She was familiar enough with all the conspiracies and clandestine operations, the pulling of strings fine as the strands of a spider's web, a silken net that covered all of Earth and the worlds beyond. That was what she had inherited, what the death of the only other living Tyrell had left to her. And what she had destroyed had turned to ashes, as cold as those in the alabaster urn with Eldon Tyrell's name engraved on the side. She had annihilated the works of his hands, the vision that had been held in the cold fish eyes behind the square-rimmed spectacles, the hole left in the heart, the center of L.A. had probably already been filled in by now. The charred ruins of the Tyrell Corporation headquarters carted off or incorporated into a new squatter ghetto. So if these two, thought Sarah Tyrell, are from the Shadow Corporation, there was no need to put words to the remainder of what had awoken and moved inside her skull. The two men standing in the center of the hovel looked like geeks, pathetic imitations of their dead boss. That was what made them dangerous, convinced her of what they claimed to be. Just as the late Eldon Tyrell, they had no need of pumped-up appearances, the visible aspects of power and threat. They lived in the dark spaces between the world's daylight manifestations, operated there, and went about their secret errands, continuing to pull the delicate spider strands that had drifted loose from a dead man's grasp. I should have known that I could never get away from them. The realization moved like a thread of ice down her spine. Not just the two men, these representatives of the Shadow Corporation that had survived after the other. The visible one was no more, but her uncle as well. It's just like the bastard, Sarah brooded. Leave it to Eldon Tyrell to achieve immortality, to find a way to go on screwing with other people's lives from beyond the grave. The image of her uncle's face with its wrinkled skin close to the bone, winter-cold optics and mocking smile faded from her sight, revealing the only slightly unsettling visages of the two men before her. She sighed, feeling the last elements of resistance draining from her body. All right, she nodded slowly. What is it you want? Why'd you come here? What do you want from me? Want from you? The eyes behind the square-rimmed glasses looked puzzled. The more talkative man tilted his head as though trying to shake something loose. We don't want anything from you. Well, his partner nudged him. Except, of course, you yourself. Pardon me? Sarah laughed, incredulous. She wouldn't have thought that these two would have been interested in anything that normal and human. That's okay, though I'm flattered. She tossed her hair back from her eyes. It had been a long time since practically the moment of their arrival at the emigrant colony that Deckard had laid a hand on her, one way or another. At some point, the resemblance between herself and the dead Rachel had ceased to be enough. But not today, thanks. The more talkative one rubbed his smooth chin. I think there's been some misunderstanding here. It's not a personal thing. It's not us, interjected his partner, who want you. It's the corporation, the Shadow Corporation. The little mad light went on again behind the square glasses. That's what needs you. That's why we spent so much time and effort looking for you, and why we came all this way to find you. That's right, his partner nodded vehemently. Without you, we're nothing. The corporation, the Shadow Corporation, it's nothing. A growing spark moved along the edges of her own suspicion. Why should that be? Her eyes narrowed as she gazed at the two men. She had a notion already, but wanted to hear it explained aloud. Miss Tyrell, isn't it obvious? The talkative one spread his empty hands apart. How can there be a Tyrell Corporation, or even its shadow, without a Tyrell to head it? You are the heir to everything that your uncle created. Both the corporation that existed in the light and the one of the darkness. There's a right of succession involved here. Surely you know. You must know that there's more to the Tyrell Corporation than merely a commercial enterprise. Oh, I know, said Sarah. I know too well. It's a matter of faith. Exactly. You must have faith just as we have. The light had intensified in both men's eyes. The faith that all the Shadow Corporation has, that Eldon Tyrell's great vision, all that he wished and planned for humanity, will be reborn. That the Tyrell Corporation will rise from the ashes, not as it was, but as something even greater, as its destiny always has been. You see, don't you? The other one spoke up. That's why the Shadow Corporation exists. That's why Eldon Tyrell created it and kept it in the darkness. You were his heir, the only other living Tyrell, and then the only Tyrell at all, and you didn't even know about it. No, I didn't. Sarah gave a shake of her head. Not really. She wasn't certain now whether she had known or not, or whether she had chosen to disbelieve the little hints and rumors, the mysteries that her uncle had alluded to with his sly conspirator smile. The mysteries that her uncle had alluded to with his sly conspirator smile. You fool, she told herself, to think you could ever kill it. He couldn't tell you about the Shadow Corporation. It had to remain a secret from everyone, even you. Only those of us sworn to its mysteries. We alone knew and waited. The man's voice trembled with fervor. For that day we knew was inevitable, the day of triumph for the Tyrell Corporation's enemies. Short-lived triumph, grumped the talkative one's partner. Yes, that's right, of course. He nodded. The darkness cannot last. The Tyrell Corporation will not be vanquished forever. If its enemies think they have destroyed it, sown salt across its ashes, they're wrong. The Tyrell Corporation, the glory of Eldon Tyrell's vision, will mount to the skies again. Already, we in the Shadow Corporation, the heirs and defenders of that vision, have set moving the great wheels and gears of justice. We like to say, the other's voice turned shy and self-conscious, that the sole of our sandal shall be upon the throat of our foes. I bet. Sarah kept her face mask-like and the gun in her hand. All this talk of enemies and retribution made her wary. When these people said they needed her, that the Tyrell Corporation's shadow entity needed her, they possibly meant they wanted her head on a pike. Her self-destructive moods hadn't included relinquishing that much control to anyone else. Well, if you have plans already, then maybe you should just go and do them. Don't let me stop you. Drop me a line now and then. Let me know how things are coming along. Right now, she mainly wanted the two odd men with their Eldon Tyrell stylings to just disappear, so that she would have time to think, to figure out what she herself would do next. There's not much sense, mused Sarah, in blowing away these two guys. That wouldn't stop anything. The thought of these two and how many others. How big was this shadow outfit, working a way to put back together all that she had so carefully disassembled, filled her with both nausea and a tightly concealed rage. Thanks for stopping by. The two men exchanged a glance with each other, then swiveled their conjunct gaze back onto her. Miss Tyrell, you really don't seem to understand. The more talkative one's voice filled with sorrow. We need you. We can't resurrect the Tyrell Corporation without you. We're loyalists, diehards, added the other man. Everyone in the Shadow Corporation. We were sworn to loyalty to Eldon Tyrell, and now to you. You didn't inherit just the Tyrell Corporation. You inherited us. You're joking. You must be. The notion appalled her. The two men suddenly appeared to her as children to whom she bore some crushing maternal obligation. As if her ancient uncle had been reborn as twins, fresh-faced and naively innocent behind the stigmata of the square glasses. The resurrection of all that she had thought was safely dead. Now what? Thought Sarah. A horrible vision came to her of these two camping out in the hovel, taking turns sleeping on the broken-backed sofa. It's no joke, Miss Tyrell. We never joke. The talkative one's expression was somber, as though even the skull beneath the tight flesh had been rendered grinless. It is our great mission, our destiny, to bring the Tyrell Corporation from the shadows where it now exists, out to the light once more, where it belongs. At the center of all, with everything orbiting around it. But that would make it the light itself. The other man frowned, like it was the sun. You're mixing up. Oh, whatever, snapped the first irritably. You know what I mean, as does Miss Tyrell. He looked back at her again. You do know, don't you, why we've come? I know, she said. There was no use denying it any longer. She didn't need the gun, not against these two, or any of their brethren, the true believers. You want me to be the head of the Tyrell Corporation, as I was before, after my uncle died. Exactly, the man nodded. You must do this. If the Tyrell Corporation is to defeat its enemies, those who are so misguided as to try to diminish Eldon Tyrell's vision. He doesn't know, thought Sarah. They don't have a clue. That she had been the one who pushed the little red button, or arranged to have it pushed by those others she had cheated and lied to. The ashes of the Tyrell Corporation headquarters, those once proud towers, and the eternal, seeming pyramid in the center of Los Angeles were on her hands. These two men and all the other die-hard loyalists behind them didn't know that she herself had destroyed the Tyrell Corporation. Without you, the man's voice came to her as though from the edge of a barely glimpsed dream. Without you, we'll die. The shadows will claim us. The vision that still unites us will be lost. Our faith gone, and we will drift off into the darkness. Then the Tyrell Corporation truly will be no more. I don't have to do a single thing. The realization moved inside Sarah. She could just stand where she was in the hovel and refuse to go with the two men. She knew they were too much in awe of her, of the Tyrell blood in her veins, to try to force her to go anywhere. Or she could go ahead and kill them. Simply raise the gun, still in her hand, place it against each man's forehead in turn. They probably wouldn't resist that either. Just accept it from her as what they deserved from a wrathful deity. Or even better, thought Sarah, I could kill myself right in front of them. That would accomplish a lot, almost everything, she decided. She'd be dead, something for which she'd been yearning for a long time now. And the Tyrell Corporation's shadow entity, this valiant little hand, this valiant little band of the faithful, would die out soon thereafter. No living Tyrell, no corporation, all lost, finally and forever. Perfect. Except for one thing. She knew just what it was. Deckard, that son of a bitch, would still be walking around, still mourning his dead Rachel, a shrine to a female replicant assembled inside his skull. Memory scraps and the taste of her kiss, the way her face had looked. My face, Sarah thought grimly. Rachel's was just a copy. When he'd forced his kiss upon her, and she had given herself to him, wanting him. She couldn't remember anymore whether that had been her or Rachel. There had been a time, a moment, when time had repeated itself. The kiss, the wanting, even his words. She had made Deckard say them again, the way he had said them to Rachel long ago. Say that you want me. He had said that. Then her voice, in the past, in memory, standing in the middle of the hovel, a world away. She closed her eyes and heard her own voice. Rachel's voice, the same. I want you. Miss Tyrell? Did you say something? She forced her eyes open and looked at the two men standing in front of her, not recognizing them for a moment, or misrecognizing them. She had the uncomfortable feeling that she was looking at her uncle, brought back from the dead and somehow doubled, with neither aspect quite human. Then the feeling passed, and she found herself once again looking at the two loyalists, ambassadors from the Shadow Corporation. If they weren't real, or at least not yet, they were certainly trying to be. A shake of the head. "No," said Sarah. She wondered if she had spoken aloud, if the words of the past had forced their way into the present once again. How embarrassing, she thought. Though it proved that nothing ever died. As long as there was memory, there were ghosts. Like me, perhaps, when Deckard looked at her. That was what she saw, the ghost of Rachel. "No, I didn't say anything." She watched as the two men consulted with each other. Whispers and nods. They finished and turned back toward her. "We don't have much time, Miss Tyrell," the more talkative one, the evident leader of the pair, clasped his hands together. "Our enemies, the enemies of the Tyrell Corporation, they very likely know that we're here. They'd do anything to stop us, to thwart our sacred mission. We have to leave, now." "We've stayed here too long already." The other one cast a nervous glance over his shoulder, toward the hovel's front door, as though he expected a black-clad SWAT team to come bursting through at any moment. "You have to come with us, Miss Tyrell." The talkative one's intertwined fingers squeezed themselves white and bloodless. "There's so much more we need to tell you, and that we can show you. But you must come with us. You must." "All right." Sarah held up a hand, palm outward. "There's no need to hector me. I've made my decision." It had been easy, once the image of Deckard had come into her mind. "I'll go with you, wherever you want." Of all the possibilities, those that had her dead while Deckard would still be alive, those had been ruled right out, as if a terminating memo had been sent down from the corporate headquarters, that columned, high-ceilinged chamber that still existed behind her brow. Besides, thought Sarah, it's mine, the Tyrell Corporation, in all its guises, shadowed or in the light. She could do whatever she wanted with it. A glance from the corner of her eye showed the two men in their homage to Eldon Tyrell outfits. In a new light, they belonged to her as well, part of the package. A familiar sensation, one that ran from her groin all the way to the top of her spine and beyond. They looked at her, not just reverently, but would not have dared to touch her. She could use them for whatever purpose she had in mind, and they would be grateful, just to be in her presence and bear her orders. The notion made her smile, one corner of her mouth lifting a millimeter. She thought of Deckard, wherever he was at this moment, perhaps coming home, if this counted as home, after his stint trolling for money at that outer Hollywood station above Earth, coming home to whatever surprise he might have figured would be waiting for him. The gun at the door probably wouldn't have been completely unexpected. If I were gone, though, Sarah mulled it over, that might knock him back, for a little while, at least, which would give her time to prepare another surprise for Deckard, the last one he'd ever receive. She wasn't sure yet what it would be, but with all the resources of the Shadow Corporation at her fingertips, a mere gun and a single bullet now struck her as entirely too simple. I'll have to do better than that, thought Sarah. It's only what he deserves. Please, Miss Tyrell. The duo's leader made a show out of checking the complicated watch on his thin wrist. "We really have to get going." "I suppose so." She turned and headed toward the hovel's bedroom. "Just let me get a few things." She took one of the bullets from the gun's clip. Using its weight to hold down on the bedside table a note she'd quickly scribbled out for Deckard. There, Sarah stood up from the mattress edge. Let him figure that one out. The alarm clock walked across the folded piece of paper and looked down at the bullet, the face behind the black hand seemingly mystified. In the minuscule bathroom, she splashed water on her face, then straightened up from the sink and pulled her dark hair back with one hand. For a moment longer, Sarah returned the gaze from the figure in the clouded mirror. It didn't look like Rachel standing there. Or only a little. The sad dreaminess that had always marked her replicant double had been leached away, replaced by something harder and colder. "That's my face," thought Sarah. The cheekbones were more pronounced, edged sharper, as though the flesh were being cut away by interior knives. She toweled off the water trickling down her throat and turned back toward the hovel's bedroom. The calendar on the wall fluttered its page as she approached the doorway. "Mrs. Niemand? I mean Sarah?" The calendar's voice betrayed its anxiety. "What are you doing? This is madness. You don't know who these men are." "How rude!" Sarah glared at the snow-covered wilderness scene. "You were listening in." "Of course. I'm a calendar. I'm supposed to keep track of things." The number-dense pages fluttered. "Listen to me. These characters are trouble. They could be anybody. Lunatics. Or maybe they really are the police. They're just lying to you to get you to go quietly." Its voice rose in pitch. "I beg of you, don't go with these people." "I have to." Sarah repositioned the strap of the little shoulder bag she had hurriedly packed. "It's my destiny, or as close to it as I'm going to get." "Sarah!" the calendar wailed as she exited the bedroom. "Let's go, gentlemen." Pulling the bag up higher, she nodded toward the hovel's front door. The two men stepped aside and let her go ahead of them. In the corridor outside, she heard tiny feet running through the decaying trash. The minute noise came from behind. She turned and looked, and saw the alarm clock racing to catch up. "Take me with you!" The clock's shrill, tiny voice sliced through the oxygen-thin air. "I want to go too!" She stopped and pulled the shoulder bag around so she could root through its contents. The gun's weight had sunk it to the bottom. By the time Sarah pulled it out, the alarm clock was right in front of her, hopping excitedly from one of its stubby little legs to the other. The shot echoed down the corridor, smudged leaves of rubble trembling in the invisible, hard-edged wave. The stimulus-hungry derelicts raised their blind heads, limbs trembling in the rush of ecstatic input, bloodied fingertips clawing convulsively at the floor grates. A smaller noise followed after the first, tinkling bits of metal and fractured micro-circuits raining softly across the spot where the alarm clock, until the last moment, had been dancing. Damn, Sarah looked at the warmed gun in her palm. Now it's empty. One of the men, the leader of the pair who had called upon her, reached over and took the gun out of her hand. "Don't worry." He threw it away, metal clanging against metal as it struck the corridor wall. "We'll get you another one."